Today, everyone will see what happens when ordinary people dare to question the court, Judge Robert Whitaker announced, his voice cutting through the marble courtroom with an authority that made every clerk and lawyer sit a little straighter, certain they were about to witness a lesson in humility for someone he considered beneath him. Claire Bennett, standing alone near the defense table, adjusted her simple navy cardigan over a white blouse, her hands lightly clutching a stack of notes, her posture calm, yet resolute. At 39, she was a high school literature teacher, known to her students for her patience and quiet wisdom. But unknown to anyone in this courtroom was the legal education she had completed years ago, graduating at the top of her class from a prestigious law school before choosing the path of teaching, leaving her brilliance hidden behind the facade of ordinary. The courtroom was filled with the usual morning crowd, reporters clicking pens, court clerks shuffling papers, the soft murmur of observers waiting for the proceedings to begin. Whitaker's eyes swept the room, then locked onto Claire with a glint of amusement, believing he held the upper hand. "Miss Bennett," he continued, his tone dripping with condescension, "you have made a habit of questioning decisions beyond your station. Today, you will learn how such behavior is handled in my courtroom." Claire's gaze remained steady, her blue eyes calm, but a faint tightening around her jaw betrayed the anticipation coiling within her, the calm before a storm she had long prepared for in her mind. She had read the case files meticulously the night before, noting procedural errors, potential oversteps, and loopholes that most would overlook, storing them like a quiet arsenal she would unleash at the right moment. The room seemed to lean in, sensing a confrontation that promised to be one-sided, everyone anticipating humiliation, yet unaware that Claire's silence carried a potency far greater than anyone could imagine. Whitaker gestured for her to approach the bench, his hand slicing through the air as if directing a scene in which she was meant to falter, stumble, and validate his superiority. Claire's steps were measured, each echoing softly on the polished oak floors, the rhythm steady, deliberate, a metronome of calm in a chamber that buzzed with whispered expectations. As she reached the designated spot, she placed her notes down carefully, folding her hands atop them, her eyes lifting to meet Whitaker's with a quiet confidence that seemed to challenge the very foundation of his authority. He smiled, assuming she would tremble, falter, or rush words she did not understand. Little did he know, the woman before him had spent years mastering the very statutes and case precedents he wielded daily, her intellect sharp, her mind agile, a hidden force cloaked beneath unassuming attire and the gentle cadence of her voice. Every inch of the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the marble floors reflecting the morning sun streaming through tall windows, the chandeliers above casting a warm light over an audience eager to see a spectacle. Yet, as Claire stood poised, the initial tension hung heavy like a thick fog, and a hush fell, subtle yet potent, signaling that the balance of power about to shift was not yet visible to anyone except her, and perhaps only her inner resolve knew the depth of what was to come. 3 weeks before the tense courtroom scene, Claire Bennett moved through her day with the quiet rhythm of someone entirely unnoticed, walking the worn sidewalks of her suburban neighborhood, her tote bag filled with lesson plans and a few personal notes, the soft clatter of her shoes against the concrete marking her presence without demanding attention. She taught American literature at Westridge High, guiding students through the pages of novels, poetry, and essays with patience and clarity, her voice calm, measured, inviting curiosity rather than commanding it. And though she looked unremarkable in her simple clothing and modest hairstyle, there was a depth in her eyes that hinted at intellect and experience. Her mornings began with the same routine, preparing her classroom, organizing materials, and greeting students as they entered, never drawing unnecessary attention, preferring the quiet dignity of her work to any recognition. Beyond school, her life was equally unassuming. She drove a reliable 4-door sedan, stopped by the local coffee shop for a cup of black coffee, exchanged polite greetings with neighbors, and carried herself with a steady, understated confidence that suggested she knew who she was without needing to prove it to anyone. Few could guess that behind the calm exterior was a woman who had once walked the halls of a prestigious law school, earning top honors, and had declined offers from prominent law firms, choosing instead a simpler path devoted to teaching and nurturing young minds. her brilliance deliberately concealed beneath her everyday demeanor. Each evening, after grading papers and preparing lessons for the next day, she would sit at her small desk, reviewing legal texts not because she needed to, but because knowledge had always been her refuge, a private world where she could exercise the sharpness of her mind without the interference of ego or expectation. Even as she engaged with colleagues, answering questions about literature, or discussing curriculum with other teachers, there was a measured attentiveness, a way of listening that allowed her to absorb more than she revealed, cataloging patterns, noticing nuances, and quietly building a mental repository of insight that would serve her when circumstances demanded more than ordinary acumen. Her students, oblivious to the hidden depths of her education, responded to her warmth and clarity, often leaving her classroom with inspiration rather than intimidation, never suspecting that their teacher possessed a strategic mind capable of dissecting complex legal arguments with ease. The weekends were spent in the local library, where she explored both literary and legal volumes, tracing lines of argument, reading case studies, and maintaining a discipline of study that few outside her life would suspect, cultivating a silent strength that was invisible yet formidable. It was this blend of humility and hidden capability that defined Claire, a woman who had mastered the art of blending in, of being underestimated, and of letting the world misjudge her until the precise moment when her knowledge, composure, and preparation would render every assumption about her incomplete and fundamentally flawed, setting the stage for the confrontation in the courtroom that would test not only the confidence of the judge, but the expectations of everyone present, all unaware that the quiet woman before them had already anticipated their disbelief and was ready to turn it to her advantage. The morning of the community meeting arrived with the usual hum of activity, reporters setting up tripods, local residents filing into folding chairs, and the polished wooden floors reflecting the early sunlight streaming through tall windows. Claire Bennett arrived 15 minutes early, carrying only her tote bag and a folder neatly organized with notes she had reviewed repeatedly the night before. She wore her favorite navy cardigan over a crisp white blouse, paired with simple gray slacks, blending seamlessly into the background of ordinary attendees. Yet every step she took conveyed a quiet confidence that drew subtle glances from those around her. Judge Robert Whitaker had already arrived, seated at the head table with his papers meticulously arranged, his polished black shoes tapping against the floor as he reviewed his agenda, clearly relishing the opportunity to assert control over the meeting and demonstrate to the town the consequences of challenging authority. As the meeting commenced, Claire listened intently to the opening statements, nodding occasionally, taking mental notes on the way the judge framed the discussion, every detail absorbed with precision. When it was her turn to speak, she rose smoothly, her posture upright but relaxed, projecting calm without arrogance. She began to articulate the concern she had regarding a recent decision, choosing her words carefully, citing relevant local statutes and precedents in a measured voice that carried clearly to every corner of the room. A few attendees shifted in their seats, surprised by the clarity and precision of her language, while Judge Whitaker's expression tightened, his initial smile faltering as he realized that the woman he intended to embarrass was commanding attention not through force, but through knowledge and reason. The room, previously buzzing with whispered commentary, gradually fell silent as Claire continued, presenting her points with a logical progression that made the procedural issues unmistakable, her calm delivery contrasting sharply with the tension in the judge's posture. Whitaker attempted to interject, using his familiar tone of condescension, expecting to interrupt or intimidate, but Claire anticipated the maneuver, responding with carefully phrased clarifications that subtly yet firmly undermined the assumptions he had built his argument upon. As she concluded, she laid her folder on the table with deliberate care, her eyes meeting the judge's with a steady gaze that communicated confidence and composure, leaving no room for dismissal. The spectators, initially expecting a performance of humiliation, were now watching a reversal unfolding before them, the judge momentarily thrown off balance, the quiet teacher revealing an unexpected authority that commanded respect. A hush lingered in the air, unbroken by whispers, as the room collectively absorbed the moment, sensing that the dynamic had shifted irrevocably, and that the ordinary woman who had appeared to be just another member of the community was, in fact, far more prepared, knowledgeable, and capable than anyone had anticipated, setting the stage for the confrontation in the courtroom to come. As the day progressed and the courtroom filled with a quiet tension, Claire Bennett found herself increasingly aware of the subtle isolation that had been woven around her by the environment and expectations. Colleagues who had been supportive in casual settings now offered hesitant glances from the gallery, whispering advice to sit down, to accept the judge's authority without protest, their concern visible but cautious, reflecting the pressure of institutional hierarchy and social perception rather than any lack of belief in her capabilities. The room itself seemed to amplify her solitude, the high ceilings and polished wooden benches emphasizing the distance between her and the rest of the participants, the murmurs of the public and the faint rustle of paper from the clerks creating a backdrop that was almost auditory. Proof of the scrutiny she faced. As she moved her attention from the judge to the observers, Claire noticed the subtle cues that suggested the audience had already formed their assumptions. Heads tilted slightly, eyebrows raised, a collective expectation that she would falter, and a sense of polite anticipation that masked the underlying curiosity and judgment present in each witness. She absorbed these cues without distraction, letting them inform her awareness of the social and psychological landscape in which she was operating, a terrain where perception often weighed as heavily as fact. Her preparation, honed over weeks of quiet study and reflection, included not only the legal statutes and procedural rules relevant to her case, but also an understanding of the human elements at play, the likely reactions, the unspoken biases, and the subtle attempts to undermine her authority by those who assumed her silence indicated weakness. Claire adjusted her notes and inhaled deeply, the rhythmic act providing a small anchor of control, a reminder that while she could not alter the initial assumptions of others, she could control the precision, clarity, and timing of her responses. Each whispered conversation, each tentative look from a fellow educator, only reinforced the necessity of measured patience and composure. The isolation she experienced was both a challenge and a tool, forcing her to rely entirely on her intellect and judgment. As the judge reviewed his notes and tapped his pen against the polished surface of the bench, apparently unaware of the meticulous preparation she had undertaken, the tension in the room became almost tangible, a silent current running beneath the formal proceedings, holding everyone in a state of anticipation. Claire felt the weight of the expectations not only from the observers, but also from the procedural demands of the court. Yet in that weight, she discovered a clarity, a focus that allowed her to mentally map the sequence of responses and points she would present. The quiet became a space of reflection and strategy, each sound, glance, and gesture around her cataloged and assessed. She understood that while the court and its occupants were designed to project authority and influence, the isolation she experienced offered a unique vantage point, a perspective from which she could see both the vulnerabilities and overextensions of those who underestimated her. The pressure, though palpable, served to sharpen her resolve, transforming what might have been discouraging solitude into an arena of opportunity, a proving ground where her knowledge, precision, and calm would ultimately become her greatest advantages against the assumptions and judgments that had surrounded her from the very moment she entered the courthouse. While the courtroom remained suspended in anticipation, Claire Bennett's mind drifted briefly to the years she had spent carefully hiding a part of herself that almost nobody knew existed. Long before she became a beloved literature teacher, before the quiet routines and modest life that defined her public image, she had been regarded as one of the most promising legal minds in her graduating class. At 24, professors spoke of her future as though it were already written, predicting prestigious appointments, influential clients, and a career that would place her among the elite ranks of the legal profession. Her academic records had been exceptional. Her understanding of constitutional law, procedural rules, and judicial ethics had earned admiration from faculty members who rarely praised students. Yet life had taken a different direction. After her father became seriously ill during her final year of law school, Claire had watched him spend his remaining months reminding her that success meant little if it came at the cost of peace, purpose, and integrity. He had been a small-town attorney who believed the law existed to protect ordinary people, not to elevate those who already possessed power. His lessons stayed with her long after his passing. Instead of pursuing a lucrative legal career, she chose education, believing that teaching young people how to think critically could create a greater impact than winning arguments in courtrooms. For years, she rarely spoke about her legal background. Most people assumed she had always been a teacher, and she never corrected them. It was easier that way. Easier to avoid attention. Easier to live quietly. Easier to let people underestimate her. Yet as she stood in the courtroom now, facing an authority figure determined to make an example of her, the years of study she had tucked away in silence began resurfacing with remarkable clarity. Every statute she had memorized, every legal principle she had debated, every ethical standard she had analyzed seemed to return effortlessly. It was as though a door long closed had quietly opened again. Across the room, Judge Whittaker continued reviewing documents with an air of confidence, completely unaware of the history standing a few feet away from him. He saw a schoolteacher. He saw someone without representation. He saw an easy victory. What he did not see was the former law prodigy who had once solved legal hypotheticals that left entire classrooms speechless. What he did not see was the disciplined mind that had spent years studying not only the letter of the law, but the principles beneath it. Claire lowered her eyes toward the notes in front of her, but she barely needed them anymore. The preparation had already been completed. The evidence had already been organized. The inconsistencies had already been identified. A calm certainty settled over her. The isolation she had felt earlier no longer seemed like a burden. It felt like freedom. There were no expectations to satisfy except her own. No reputation to protect. No title to defend. Only the truth. As sunlight filtered through the tall courtroom windows and painted golden reflections across the polished floor, a subtle shift occurred inside her. The uncertainty others expected was gone. In its place stood quiet conviction. Around her, observers continued whispering predictions about how the proceedings might unfold. None of them knew the secret that had remained hidden for more than a decade. None of them realized that the woman standing alone had spent years preparing for a moment very much like this. And none of them could have imagined that the confidence radiating from the bench was about to collide with something far more powerful than authority. It was about to collide with knowledge. The truth was that Claire Bennett had never entered the courthouse unprepared. Long before the hearing date had arrived, she had spent countless evenings at the small wooden desk in her living room, a warm lamp casting light across neatly organized stacks of documents while the rest of the neighborhood slept. Outside, the quiet suburban street remained still beneath the glow of streetlights, but inside her modest home, a different kind of work had been unfolding. Every public record connected to the case had been reviewed. Every filing had been examined. Every procedural step had been traced with the patience of someone who understood that details often revealed more than grand arguments ever could. While others assumed she was merely reacting to circumstances, Claire had been quietly building a complete picture of what had happened. As she compared timelines, notices, meeting transcripts, and court records, certain inconsistencies began to emerge. At first they appeared minor, the sort of discrepancies most people would overlook. Dates that did not align, references that contradicted official documentation, statements that seemed harmless until placed beside other records. Yet the deeper she looked, the clearer the pattern became. What appeared to be isolated mistakes started connecting into something much larger. Claire never rushed to conclusions. She had learned years ago that assumptions were dangerous. Facts mattered. Evidence mattered. Precision mattered. So she continued digging. Night after night, she highlighted passages, cross-referenced regulations, and created detailed notes in the margins of her files. More than once she discovered information that surprised even her. Certain procedural decisions appeared to bypass standard requirements. Certain actions seemed inconsistent with established legal practices. The further she progressed, the more confident she became that the situation was not nearly as straightforward as many people believed. Yet she told no one. Not her colleagues. Not her neighbors. Not even the few friends who had encouraged her to settle the matter quietly and move on. She understood the value of patience. Revealing information too early would only allow others to prepare explanations. Silence was often more powerful than confrontation. Back in the courtroom, she sat quietly while the audience continued to speculate about her chances. Some believed she was courageous. Others believed she was naive. Neither group understood what she carried inside the folder resting calmly on the table before her. Within those pages were observations, timelines, records, and carefully organized evidence that transformed the entire narrative surrounding the case. Across the room, Judge Whitaker appeared relaxed, occasionally exchanging brief remarks with court personnel while reviewing his own documents. His confidence remained intact because he believed he already understood his opponent. He believed he had accurately measured her capabilities. That assumption would soon become his greatest weakness. Claire watched him without emotion. There was no anger in her expression, no desire for revenge, only certainty. She knew what the records showed. She knew what the procedures required. Most importantly, she knew exactly when to introduce each piece of information. The courtroom remained filled with quiet anticipation as spectators shifted in their seats and reporters prepared their notebooks. None of them realized that the balance of power had already begun to change. The preparation was complete. The pieces were in place. And for the first time since the proceedings had begun, Claire felt something unexpected. She felt completely calm. Because while everyone else was preparing for an argument, she was preparing for a revelation. The moment finally arrived when silence gave way to action. Judge Robert Whitaker straightened in his chair and began what he assumed would be the decisive phase of the proceedings, his voice carrying confidently across the courtroom as he summarized his position and emphasized the conclusions he expected everyone present to accept. Several spectators nodded along. A few reporters prepared their headlines. The outcome appeared obvious. Then Claire Bennett calmly rose from her seat. She did not rush. She did not raise her voice. She simply gathered a small stack of documents and approached the podium with the quiet confidence of someone who already knew where the facts would lead. The room watched with cautious curiosity. Whitaker folded his arms, expecting a brief response that he could easily dismiss. Instead, Claire began asking questions. Her tone was respectful. Her wording was precise. The first question concerned a procedural timeline. Whitaker answered quickly. Claire then produced an official record showing a discrepancy. A few heads turned. The judge adjusted his posture slightly. Claire continued. Her second question focused on a filing date connected to a key decision. Again, Whitaker responded with certainty. Again, Claire presented documentation that contradicted the explanation. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Even the reporters slowed their writing. Claire never appeared emotional. She simply moved from one point to the next, allowing the records to speak for themselves. Each document connected logically to the one before it. Each question narrowed the available explanations. The confidence that had filled the room earlier began to shift. A court clerk glanced at another clerk. An attorney seated in the gallery leaned forward. The atmosphere changed. Whitaker attempted to regain control by redirecting the discussion, but Claire anticipated the move. She referenced the exact procedural rule involved and cited supporting language with remarkable accuracy. The judge paused. For the first time all day, his response came a little slower. Claire then introduced a timeline she had assembled from public records. The sequence exposed multiple inconsistencies that nobody had previously examined together. A hush fell across the courtroom. One reporter lowered his pen completely. Another quietly exchanged a look with a colleague. Claire continued with calm determination, never attacking anyone personally, never showing hostility, only presenting facts in a sequence that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Every answer generated a new question. Every question led to another record. Every record strengthened the pattern she had uncovered. The spectators who had expected to witness her embarrassment now sat motionless, watching a completely different story unfold. Whitaker's earlier confidence began to fade beneath growing uncertainty. He reviewed documents. He requested clarification. He searched for openings in her logic. None appeared. Claire had prepared too thoroughly. Her arguments were organized with extraordinary discipline. The room became so quiet that the turning of pages sounded unusually loud. Then came the final document. Claire placed it on the podium and calmly explained how it connected the previous records together. The significance was immediate. Several people visibly reacted. An attorney in the back row slowly removed his glasses. A reporter stopped typing altogether. The courtroom remained frozen in silence. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The assumptions that had defined the entire proceeding suddenly seemed fragile. Standing beneath the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, Claire remained perfectly composed while the weight of the evidence settled over the room. And in that silence, everyone present began to realize that the quiet teacher they had underestimated understood far more than anyone had imagined. The silence lingered long after Claire Bennett finished speaking. It was the kind of silence that could not be manufactured, the kind that appeared only when assumptions collapsed in real time. For several seconds, nobody moved. The reporters stared at their notes. The attorneys exchanged uncertain glances. Even the court staff seemed unsure what to do next. Judge Robert Whitaker sat motionless behind the bench, looking down at the documents that had dismantled the narrative he had spent weeks constructing. The confidence that had once filled his voice was gone. In its place was the uncomfortable realization that the person he had underestimated understood every detail of the process with remarkable precision. Claire remained calm. She did not celebrate. She did not smile. She simply stood quietly, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. Eventually, the proceedings came to a close. What followed over the next several days spread throughout the community faster than anyone expected. Local newspapers published stories about the hearing. Legal analysts discussed the procedural concerns that had been exposed. Questions were raised. Reviews were initiated. Conversations that once happened behind closed doors were suddenly taking place in public. For the first time in years, people began looking more closely at decisions they had previously accepted without question. Yet while the town debated what had happened, Claire returned to her ordinary life. On Monday morning, she walked back into her classroom, carrying the same tote bag she always carried. She greeted her students with the same warm smile. She discussed literature. She graded assignments. She helped struggling students after school. Nothing about her routine changed. To Claire, the hearing had never been about recognition. It had never been about proving she was smarter than anyone else. It had been about standing firm when truth mattered. A week later, one of her students approached her after class. The young girl hesitated before speaking. "Miss Bennett," she said softly, "is it true that you studied law?" Claire looked up from the stack of papers on her desk. Several students nearby immediately became curious. The classroom grew quiet. She smiled gently. "A long time ago," she replied. The student looked confused. "Then why did you never tell anyone?" Claire paused for a moment. Sunlight streamed through the classroom windows, illuminating the rows of desks and bookshelves around her. Then she answered with the same quiet wisdom that had guided her entire life. "Because titles do not tell you who a person is. Character does." The room went silent. The students absorbed the words more carefully than any lesson she had taught that week. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the school grounds. Inside, a deeper lesson remained. People often mistake confidence for competence. They mistake status for wisdom. They mistake appearances for truth. But every now and then, life reminds them how wrong those assumptions can be. Claire Bennett never needed a courtroom to prove her worth. She never needed applause. She never needed recognition. The people who judged her had measured her by what they could see. Their mistake was failing to recognize everything they could not. And on that day, an entire community learned something they would not soon forget. Respect is not earned through power. It is earned through integrity. And true knowledge rarely needs to announce itself.